A music producer stops in her tracks, captivated by the haunting sound of a saxophone. The man playing, Marcus "Mac" Thompson, once a rising star in jazz, now a street musician lost to time. Join us at H2 Black Thread as we uncover a story of love, betrayal, and redemption. Don't forget to leave a comment sharing your thoughts and subscribe to the channel to stay updated with our latest videos. Because the truth deserves to be told. Let's begin. The city of New Orleans pulsed with its usual rhythm. Laughter spilling from bars, the scent of Creole spices wafting from food stalls, and the ever-present hum of street performers vying for attention in Jackson Square. A hot afternoon sun glared down on the old cobblestone streets, turning them into mirrors of golden light. The square was alive with tourists snapping photos, street vendors calling out their best deals, and the lively chatter of people enjoying their beignets from Café du Monde. In the midst of this chaotic symphony, a different kind of melody drifted through the air, low, sorrowful, and rich with emotion. It cut through the noise like a whisper in a crowded room, compelling enough to make even the most hurried pedestrians slow their steps. And it stopped Olivia Morgan in her tracks. Dressed in a fitted maroon blazer and matching pencil skirt, Olivia wasn't the type to linger. She was a woman constantly in motion, her mind always 3 steps ahead. As a respected music producer, she had built a career on discovering voices that couldn't be ignored, raw talent, the kind that could make the hairs on your arms stand on end. She wasn't in the business of nostalgia, nor did she believe in sentimentality for forgotten artists. The industry moved too fast for that. But this was different. She turned toward the source of the sound, eyes scanning the busy square. And then she saw him. There, near the old stone fountain, sat a man hunched over an aged saxophone, the brass dulled by time and wear. His fingers moved with practiced ease, dancing over the instrument's keys like they had never forgotten their purpose. He was an older man, perhaps in his 60s, with deep brown skin weathered by the sun and the hardships of a life hard-lived. His salt and pepper beard framed a face that spoke of lost battles and long-forgotten glories. His clothes, a tattered black trench coat and frayed dress pants, suggested he had once known better days. But none of that mattered, because his music was magnificent. The notes that floated from his saxophone weren't just sounds. They were stories woven through melody, of love lost, of dreams deferred, of nights spent under neon lights and mornings that came too soon. Olivia felt a strange tightening in her chest. This was jazz at its purest, not the polished, commercialized kind she heard in modern studios, but the type that was born in smoky clubs and back alleys, played by men who poured their souls into brass and woodwind, hoping someone, anyone, would listen. She wasn't the only one who noticed. A man in a suit slowed, brows knitting together as if trying to place the melody in his memory. A young woman carrying shopping bags hesitated, stealing a glance before hurrying along. A group of teenagers paused just long enough to smirk before moving on. And yet, no one stopped. No one dropped $1 into the open saxophone case at his feet. No one clapped at the end of his song. The world simply moved on, leaving him to play for no one. Except Olivia stayed. The final note lingered in the air like the last breath of a dying dream before fading into the city's unyielding noise. The man lowered his saxophone, sighing as he wiped a sleeve over his forehead. When he finally looked up, he found Olivia standing a few feet away. Dark brown eyes met hers, tired, wary, yet still holding onto something she couldn't quite name. She cleared her throat. "That was incredible." The man let out a soft chuckle, though there was no humor in it. "Is that right?" His voice was deep, sandpaper rough, like someone who had spent too many nights with whiskey and too many years with regret. Olivia nodded. "Where did you learn to play like that?" The man hesitated, his fingers flexing over the saxophone. Then, with a shrug, he said, "A long time ago." His gaze flickered toward her tailored outfit, the sleek black briefcase in her hand, the way she carried herself with the kind of confidence that only came from knowing one's own power. He let out a breath. "You with some record label or something?" Olivia tilted her head, considering him. "You tell me, you recognize me?" The man studied her for a long moment. Then, something shifted in his expression. Recognition. Morgan. The name left his lips like a ghost rising from the past. "Olivia Morgan. You're Joseph Morgan's daughter." Now it was Olivia's turn to freeze. She hadn't expected him to know her father, a once great jazz musician who had been pushed aside by an industry that had no patience for aging legends. Her father had died poor and forgotten, playing in dive bars for tips while the men who once called him brother went on to win Grammys. The music industry had discarded him, just like it had discarded the man before her. "You knew my father?" she asked quietly. The man exhaled. "Knew him. I played with him." Olivia's stomach clenched. If he played with Joseph Morgan, that meant— "What's your name?" she demanded. The man hesitated before answering. Marcus Mac Thompson." The name hit her like a freight train. Mac Thompson. She had heard that name before. Her father had spoken of him, a saxophonist so talented that he could bring a room to tears with a single note. He had played with jazz legends. His sound was distinct, unforgettable. And then, one day, he was gone. She remembered asking her father what had happened to him. Her father had simply shaken his head and said, "The industry breaks people, baby. It took Mac, and it'll take me too." And now, here he was, a ghost of his former self, playing to an audience that no longer remembered his name. A long silence stretched between them. Then Olivia stepped forward. "You still got it." Mac huffed out a laugh. "Yeah, and what's that worth out here?" He gestured toward his open saxophone case. Inside, only a few crumpled dollars and loose change. But Olivia wasn't looking at the money. She was looking at a man who had been left behind by an industry that only cared about the next big thing. A man who had been erased. And she knew, in that moment, she couldn't just walk away. She pulled out her phone and opened the camera. "Let's find out." Mac frowned. "Find out what?" Olivia tapped the screen. "If the world is ready to remember you." And with that, she hit record, unaware that this moment would change everything. The streets of New Orleans had begun their slow transition from the golden haze of late afternoon to the neon-lit hum of evening. The air was thick with the scent of bayonets, roasted pecans, and the distant promise of rain. Music spilled from open-door jazz clubs, blending into the distant murmur of conversation and the occasional honk of a passing streetcar. But none of it, not the laughter, not the chatter, not even the familiar pulse of the city, existed for Marcus Mac Thompson at this moment. Because for the first time in 20 years, someone had called him by name. Sitting on the worn wooden bench in Jackson Square, Mac studied Olivia Morgan like he was seeing a ghost. He had heard the name before, had known it before, long before she was the confident, sharply dressed woman standing before him now. She was Joseph Morgan's daughter. He hadn't thought about Joseph in years. Hell, there were days when he had done everything possible to forget, but forgetting was a luxury Mac had never been able to afford. He ran a calloused hand over the bell of his saxophone, exhaling slowly. "So what's the big idea, Olivia?" he asked, voice rough like the gravel under their feet. "Why'd you stop?" She crossed her arms, studying him with an intensity that made him uneasy. "I know talent when I hear it," she said simply. "And I know who you are." Mac let out a low chuckle, though there was no humor in it. "Do you?" He tapped the side of his saxophone. "Because last I checked, Mac Thompson doesn't exist anymore." Olivia frowned, clearly not convinced. "My father used to talk about you," she said. "Said you had the kind of sound that could stop time." Mac scoffed, shaking his head. Your old man had a habit of saying things that weren't always true. He also said you disappeared, Olivia pressed. One day you were playing in every major club, the next you were gone. Mac's fingers tightened around his saxophone. Guess I wasn't cut out for the big time. Olivia sat beside him, not buying it for a second. The industry doesn't just forget people like you, she said. What really happened? Mac exhaled heavily, letting the weight of the past settle over his shoulders. He had been young when he first made his way into the New Orleans jazz scene. A kid from Baton Rouge with nothing but his saxophone and a head full of dreams. He played in back alley bars, earned his keep on street corners, and eventually found himself standing beside legends. By the time he was in his late 20s, Mac wasn't just playing jazz, he was shaping it. Then, Ray Carter walked into his life. At the time, Ray was like a brother. They wrote music together, shared late-night jam sessions over half-empty bottles of bourbon, and made promises about the future. Then came the contract, the piece of paper that should have secured his legacy. Instead, it stole everything. Mac ran a hand over his face, staring at the distant glow of a neon Sazerac bar sign. You ever trust someone so much that you don't think twice when they hand you something to sign? He asked, his voice quieter now. Olivia's silence told him she already knew the answer. He told me we were partners, Mac continued. That the record deal would put both of our names on everything we'd written, that we'd split the royalties down the middle. He gave a bitter chuckle. But the contract, it didn't say that. What it said was that every song, every arrangement, everything I'd ever played was owned by him. He shook his head, jaw clenching. It was all legal. I signed my own damn career away. Olivia's brows furrowed. Did you try to fight it? Mac let out a slow breath. I did. I got a lawyer, thought I could take him to court, but Ray had money, connections. I had nothing. By the time I realized what had happened, I was blacklisted. No gigs, no work, nothing. Olivia watched him carefully. So what happened after that? Max shrugged. I tried to get by, played for drinks, for a bed to sleep in. Then I just stopped trying. The words hung between them, heavy like the summer heat pressing down on the square. Olivia looked at the saxophone in his hands. But you didn't stop playing. Mac laughed dryly, shaking his head. Nah, never stopped playing. He glanced at the empty sax case at his feet. Just stopped getting paid for it. She studied him, something flickering in her expression. Do you want it back? Mac blinked. What? Your music, Olivia said. Your name. Your life. Do you want it back? For a moment, Mac didn't answer. He wanted to say yes. He wanted to tell her that every time he picked up the saxophone, he could feel the weight of what should have been pressing down on his chest. That he had spent years wondering what his life would have looked like if he had just read that contract a little closer. But fear was a funny thing. Because as much as he hated what had happened, there was a part of him that had grown comfortable with being forgotten. It was easier than fighting to be remembered. Finally, he forced out a chuckle. What's the point? He said. I'm just an old man with a saxophone. You're a big-time producer. You don't need to waste your time on me. Olivia leaned forward, her gaze sharp. I don't waste my time, she said, and I don't believe in letting the industry decide who gets to matter. Mac looked at her for a long moment. And then, for the first time in years, he felt something that scared him more than anything else. Hope. Olivia stood, brushing off her blazer. Listen, she said. I have a meeting with a radio executive tomorrow, someone who's always looking for a fresh sound. Mac frowned. You want me to play for some radio guy? I want you to play for the world, Olivia corrected. But first, I need to know something. She pulled out her phone, scrolling through her messages. Then she turned the screen toward him. A direct message from Ray Carter. Ray Carter, I need to talk to Marcus, please. The world around Mac seemed to tilt, his breath caught. For 2 decades, Ray had stolen everything from him, and now, out of nowhere, he wanted to talk. His hands tightened into fists. Son of a bitch, he muttered. Olivia watched him, carefully measuring her next words. Meet with me tomorrow, she said. Let's hear what he has to say. Mac clenched his jaw. Every instinct in him screamed to walk away, to forget about Ray, to keep playing on the streets where no one could take anything else from him. But deep down, in a place he barely acknowledged, he wanted answers. Maybe, just maybe, he even wanted justice. He exhaled sharply, then nodded. "Fine," he said. "But if he tries to screw me over again, he won't," Olivia promised. "Not this time." And with that, the past was no longer behind him. It was waiting for him. The night had settled over New Orleans, wrapping the city in a warm, buzzing glow. Streetlights flickered against the cobblestone roads, their golden hue reflecting off the puddles left behind by an earlier drizzle. Jackson Square, though quieter now, still thrived with life. The hum of distant jazz clubs, the occasional laughter from tourists wandering past, and the smell of café au lait and fresh bannets drifting from Café du Monde. But for Marcus Mac Thompson, none of that mattered. All he could think about was the text message on Olivia Morgan's phone. "Ray Carter, I need to talk to Marcus, please." That name alone had reopened a wound 20 years deep. Mac had walked away that night without saying much. He had barely slept, replaying every memory of Ray, the nights they had spent writing music, the promises of partnership, the moment he realized he had signed his own name away. And now, out of nowhere, Ray wanted to talk. It made no damn sense. The bitterness sat heavy in his chest as he made his way toward a small café on Frenchman Street, where Olivia had told him to meet her. It was far from the upscale jazz clubs he once played, but it had something those places didn't: a corner stage, a microphone, and an audience that actually listened. And tonight, Mac was about to be heard. Olivia was already inside when Mac arrived. She was seated near the back, scrolling through her phone, her blazer draped over the chair beside her. When she looked up and saw him, she smiled. "I wasn't sure you'd show," she admitted. Mac grunted, pulling out the chair opposite her. "Didn't think I would either." She set her phone down. "Did you think about what I said?" he sighed, leaning back. "I thought about it all right, and the only thing I figured out is that I don't trust that bastard." Olivia nodded. "I wouldn't expect you to." She paused, then leaned forward, her voice quieter now. "But I meant the other part too, about getting your name back." Mac exhaled slowly, staring at the worn wooden table between them. He had spent so many years being forgotten that the idea of being remembered again almost felt impossible. But the truth was, no matter how much he tried to ignore it, he wanted this. Maybe not the fame, maybe not the spotlight, but his music, his legacy. That was something he would never stop wanting back. Finally, he looked up at Olivia. "And how exactly do you plan on doing that?" she grinned. "Funny you should ask." She pulled out her phone, tapping on the screen before turning it toward him. The video played. At first, Mac didn't understand what he was looking at. It was him, sitting in Jackson Square, his fingers dancing over his saxophone, the music flowing like liquid gold beneath the streetlights. He remembered the moment well. Olivia had pulled out her phone, told him to just play, and for reasons he still didn't understand, he had let her. But as the video continued, he noticed something else. The numbers: 512,000 views, 83,000 likes, over 12,000 comments. Mac blinked. "What the hell is this?" Olivia smirked. "That, Mac, is you going viral." Mac had never been a technology guy. He had owned a flip phone once, but it had been stolen years ago. He had never sent an email, never streamed music, never understood the world of social media. But even he knew what viral meant. 500,000 views. His voice was rough with disbelief. Olivia nodded. "And that's just from my page. It's all over the internet. People are obsessed with you." Mac let out a disbelieving laugh, rubbing a hand down his face. "There are comments from music critics, jazz lovers, even some big-name artists," Olivia continued. "Everyone wants to know, who is Mac Thompson and why isn't he famous?" Mac swallowed hard, feeling a mix of emotions he couldn't quite name. For years, he had been playing for empty spaces, for people who never stopped to listen. And now, all of a sudden, the whole world was listening. I don't know what to say, he admitted. Olivia leaned forward. Then don't say anything. She pointed toward the small stage in the corner of the cafe. Play. Mac's heartbeat quickened. What now? She grinned. Now. Mac hesitated. The stage wasn't big, wasn't fancy. There were maybe 15 people in the cafe, their conversation soft, unaware of what was about to happen. But Olivia was watching him expectantly, and something inside him whispered, just this once, Mac. Just try. So he took a deep breath, stood, and walked toward the stage. Every step felt like a lifetime. He took his place on the stool, adjusting the saxophone strap across his shoulder. A few people glanced up, their expressions mildly curious. No one recognized him. Not yet. He closed his eyes, let his fingers find their place on the keys, and then he played. The first note was soft, like a whisper. Then came the next, then the next, until the cafe was no longer just a cafe. It was a concert hall, a dreamscape, a memory unfolding in real time. His saxophone wept and soared, telling stories no words ever could. Of love found and lost, of friendships betrayed, of nights spent drowning in the echoes of what could have been. And this time, people listened. Conversations stopped. Drinks were left untouched. By the time he reached the final note, the cafe was silent. Then applause. Loud, thunderous applause. Mac's hands trembled. His throat tightened. For the first time in 2 decades, he had an audience that saw him. And it nearly broke him. As he stepped off the stage, Olivia was already holding up her phone. Look at this. She turned the screen to him. The live stream had just passed 1 million views. Mac stared. That can't be right, Olivia laughed. Oh, it's very right. His mind spun. He felt like he had just walked into a world that had forgotten him, only to realize it had been waiting for him all along. Then his eyes dropped to the phone screen. A new message had popped up. Ray Carter, Mac, please, I need to talk to you. Mac's stomach twisted. There it was. The past coming for him all over again. Olivia watched him carefully. So, what do you want to do? Mac let out a long breath. He had spent 20 years running. Maybe it was time to stop. Maybe it was time to face Ray Carter once and for all. The rain had started falling just as Marcus Mac Thompson left the cafe. Not the kind of heavy, storm-born rain that sent people scurrying for shelter, but the kind that drizzled down softly, soaking into the streets of New Orleans like a quiet confession. The neon signs of Frenchman Street reflected against the wet pavement, their colors dancing in a blur of red, green, and gold. Mac barely noticed. He still felt the warmth of the standing ovation from the cafe, the lingering hum of his saxophone in his bones. But it was nothing compared to the cold knot forming in his chest, because of one message. Ray Carter, Mac, please, I need to talk to you. Ray, the man who had stolen everything. Mac's fingers tightened around his saxophone case as he stood under the awning of a closed record shop, his breath curling in the cool air. His heart pounded against his ribs, not with excitement but with something darker. For 20 years, he had imagined this moment. In his worst nights, he had dreamt of revenge, of confronting Ray in a crowded room, exposing him for the fraud he was. In his best nights, he had dreamt of nothing at all. And now he had a choice. The soft tap of heels against the wet pavement broke his thoughts. Mac. He turned to see Olivia Morgan, her maroon blazer slightly damp from the mist, her phone still in hand. She didn't say anything at first, just studied him. You okay? She finally asked. Mac let out a slow breath, shaking his head. I don't know. She nodded, then held out the phone. He sent his number, she said. You don't have to call him, but if you want to. Mac stared at the screen. The number glowed up at him like a ghost waiting to be resurrected. He took it from her with an unsteady hand. Then, before he could change his mind, he pressed call. The line rang twice before picking up. Silence. Then a voice Mac hadn't heard in 20 years. Mac. It was hoarse, like a man who had been waiting for this moment just as long. Mac's grip on the phone tightened. "Talk," he said, his voice colder than the rain around him. Ray exhaled. I don't know where to start." "Start with why the hell you're calling me." A pause. Then, finally, "I need to see you." Mac barked out a laugh, shaking his head. "You need to see me," he echoed, incredulous. "The man who took everything from me suddenly has the nerve to." He stopped, swallowing down the bitterness rising in his throat. "Give me one good reason." Ray hesitated. Then, quietly, "Because I still have your music." The world tilted. The next afternoon, Mac found himself outside a small recording studio tucked between a row of forgotten buildings on the outskirts of town. The sign above the door read, "Holloway Sound Studios." He almost turned around, almost walked away and let the past stay buried. But then Olivia stepped beside him. "You don't have to do this alone," she said. Mac let out a slow breath. Then, without another word, he pushed open the door. Inside, the studio smelled like dust, old vinyl, and something painfully familiar. The walls were lined with framed records, some of them Mac recognized, albums he had played on but never been credited for. Then he saw him. Ray Carter. The man sitting on the worn-out leather couch looked different. He was older, his once slick blonde hair now gray at the temples. His once polished suits were replaced with a simple button-down and slacks. And his face, he looked like a man who had spent years carrying regret. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then Ray stood slowly, clearing his throat. "You look good, Mac." Mac crossed his arms. "Can't say the same for you." Ray let out a short chuckle, but there was no humor in it. "You didn't have to come," he admitted. "But I'm glad you did." Mac's jaw clenched. "Cut the bullshit, Ray." "What do you want?" Ray sighed, rubbing a hand over his face before walking over to a small filing cabinet in the corner. He opened it, pulled out a thick envelope, and turned back to face Mac. Then, with both hands shaking, he held it out. "Your music," he said. "Everything I took from you." Mac didn't move. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of a distant radio. For a long time, Mac just stared at the envelope, his chest tight. "You're telling me you never sold them?" he finally asked. Ray swallowed. "No." Mac's eyes narrowed. "Why not?" Ray hesitated. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, "Because I knew I didn't deserve them." Ray sat down, his shoulders slumped as if this conversation had been waiting to break him for decades. "I told myself that if I didn't take those songs, someone else would," he admitted. "I was ambitious, Mac. I wanted the fame, the money, the respect, and I convinced myself that I deserved it more than you did." Mac's hands curled into fists. Ray let out a breath. "But the truth is, I could never play like you, and I knew it." His voice cracked. "I built my career off your work. But I never felt like it was mine." Mac's heart pounded in his chest. He had imagined this moment for years, but he had never imagined Ray looking like this, tired, defeated, broken under the weight of his own actions. Ray slid the envelope across the table. "This belongs to you," he said. "It always did." Mac hesitated. Then, slowly, he picked it up. His name was there, on the copyrights. On the records. It was his, all of it. Mac could have walked out that door, could have left Ray behind to drown in his own regrets. But something inside him said not yet. So after a long pause, he finally asked, "Why now, Ray?" Ray met his gaze, and for the first time in decades, Mac saw something in those blue eyes that he never thought he'd see again. Regret. And maybe, just maybe, redemption. "I saw your video," Ray admitted. "And I realized that the world still wants to hear you, Mac." A long silence stretched between them. Then, for the first time in 20 years, Mac said the words he never thought he'd say. "So what happens now?" Olivia, who had been watching from the doorway, finally stepped forward. "Now," she said with a smile, "we bring you back." Mac's fingers tightened around the envelope. For the first time in 20 years, his name was his again. And this time, no one could take it from him. The envelope sat on Marcus Mac Thompson's hotel nightstand, untouched. It had been there for 3 days. Every morning he woke up and saw it. His name printed on legal documents, his music returned to him, his legacy waiting for him to reclaim. And every morning he ignored it. He would get up, take a long walk down the Mississippi riverfront, listen to the city come alive with music and movement. But the closer he got to Frenchman Street, the heart of jazz, the more his feet hesitated. He wasn't ready. Not yet. The afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting golden streaks over the wrought iron balconies of New Orleans. The scent of roasted pecans and chicory coffee drifted through the air. Mac sat on a bench near Jackson Square, his saxophone case beside him, unopened. He had spent 20 years playing for himself, unseen, unheard. Now the world was watching, and that scared him more than anything. Footsteps approached. "I figured I'd find you here." Mac didn't need to look up to know it was Olivia Morgan. She sat down next to him, crossing one leg over the other. A Café du Monde coffee cup in one hand, her phone in the other. She set the coffee beside him. "Drink. You look like you need it." Mac grunted, taking the cup but saying nothing. For a moment neither of them spoke. They just listened to the distant sound of a trumpet player serenading tourists outside a voodoo shop. Finally, Olivia broke the silence. "You're stalling." Mac exhaled through his nose, rubbing a hand over his beard. "You think I don't know that?" She tilted her head. "So what are you afraid of?" Mac didn't answer right away, not because he didn't know, but because saying it out loud would make it real. Mac set his coffee down and stared straight ahead. "What if I get up there," he finally said, "and it's all gone?" Olivia frowned. "What do you mean?" Mac let out a slow breath, his fingers flexing over his knees. "The music." He nodded toward his saxophone case. "The feeling, the way it used to come so easy. What if I get up there and it's just gone?" Olivia was quiet for a moment. Then softly she said, "You played in a cafe last week and you shut the whole damn place down." Mac shook his head. "That was different." "How?" "Because nobody expected anything." He turned to look at her. "That was just me doing what I've always done, but this," his voice lowered, "this is me proving that I still belong." He gestured to the blue note flyer Olivia had given him the night before. Marcus Mac Thompson live one night only. His name was bold. His first real performance in 20 years, and that terrified him. Olivia studied him for a long time before sighing. "Mac, do you know how many artists I've worked with who thought they'd never play again?" He didn't answer. She tapped her nails against her phone screen. "And do you know what the difference is between the ones who made it back and the ones who didn't?" Mac exhaled. "Let me guess, confidence," she smirked. "No, showing up." Mac looked at her, expression unreadable. She leaned forward, elbows on her knees. "The fear, it never goes away, but the ones who make it, they play anyway." She stood, brushing off her blazer. "Show up, Mac." Then she walked away. And for the first time in days, Mac picked up the envelope. The blue note was packed. Mac hadn't set foot in the club in over 2 decades, but it looked the same. Red velvet curtains, dark wooden floors, framed pictures of legends who had played there before. He had once been one of them. Now he wasn't so sure. He stood just beyond the curtain, hidden from the audience. The place was full, people murmuring with excitement, but Mac barely heard them. His hands were shaking. He wasn't sure he could do this. A hand touched his arm. He turned to see Ray Carter. Mac's jaw clenched. "What the hell are you doing here?" Ray held up his hands. "I just wanted to see it, to see you play again." Mac narrowed his eyes. "You think showing up makes up for what you did?" Ray swallowed. "No, but you deserve this moment, Mac, and whether you believe it or not, I'm here for you." Mac studied him, then turned away. He didn't have time for ghosts tonight. Then a voice over the speakers cut through the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Marcus Mac Thompson." The audience erupted into thunderous applause. Mac's pulse roared in his ears. Then he took a deep breath and stepped into the light. The lights were blinding. The audience was a blur of faces. Mac sat down, his saxophone feeling heavier than it ever had before. He looked out into the crowd. Some people were waiting to be impressed. Others were waiting to see if he would fail. And for a moment he almost did. He lifted the saxophone, his fingers hovering over the keys. But then, nothing. His throat tightened, his chest burned, and then from the back of the room a single voice rang out. "We still remember you, Mac." It wasn't Olivia, it wasn't Ray. It was a young saxophonist in the front row, no older than 20, holding onto a well-worn notebook full of Mac's old music. Mac swallowed hard, then with shaking hands he played. The first note was quiet, unsteady. Then the second, then the third, and then, just like that, it was back. The music poured out of him, raw and untamed, telling every story he had never spoken. The club was silent, every person hanging on to every note. Then, when the final sound faded, the entire audience stood. And Mac closed his eyes, letting the moment wash over him. For 20 years he had been afraid of returning. Now there was nothing to fear, because he had never really left. For the first time in 20 years, Marcus "Mac" Thompson felt alive. The stage lights burned hot against his skin. The weight of his saxophone pressed firm against his chest. The sound of the final note still hung in the air, stretching into the silence of the packed Blue Note Jazz Club. And then applause. Not polite applause, not the kind of scattered clapping people give out of obligation. No, this was something else. This was a roar, a tidal wave of cheers, whistles, and stomping feet, the kind of sound that told him the audience hadn't just listened, they had felt every note. Max sat there, fingers trembling against the brass of his saxophone, staring out into the crowd. Faces blurred together, some young, some old. Some wide-eyed in wonder, others wiping away silent tears. In the front row, a woman clutched a framed record album, one of the few recordings Mac had ever been credited on, long before Ray Carter stole his music and his name. And in the far back, standing just beyond the neon glow of the bar, was Ray himself. Mac's gaze lingered on him for a long moment. Ray wasn't smiling. He wasn't clapping. But his eyes glistened and his head dipped just slightly, as if to say, "I was wrong. And I know it." Mac didn't know what to do with that, so instead he turned his attention back to the crowd. He took a deep breath, lifted his saxophone again, and let the music speak for him. This time, he didn't hesitate. This time, the first note came bold and clear, rising like smoke curling through the dimly lit club. And when the second note followed, the audience fell into a hush once more. Mac's fingers danced over the keys, effortlessly weaving through scales, bends, and tremolos with the ease of a man who had never stopped playing, even when the world stopped listening. Each note told a story of the nights he spent sleeping under bridges, his saxophone the only thing keeping him warm. A story of the years he wasted watching other men perform his music, their names in lights while he played for spare change on street corners. A story of loss, of betrayal, of a legacy stolen, and now, finally, a story of returning home. Somewhere near the back of the club, a young saxophonist clutched his notebook, eyes wide as he studied Mac's every movement. He was taking notes, learning, listening. And that was when Mac realized this wasn't just about him anymore. He wasn't just reclaiming his name tonight. He was making sure it was never forgotten again. By the time the last note rang out, the club had transformed. People who had walked in as strangers now clung to each other, swaying to the rhythm of a song that had carved itself into their souls. And when Mac finally lowered his saxophone, an eerie silence followed. No one spoke. No one even moved. And then the entire club stood as one. The applause was deafening, an explosion of sound so powerful it sent vibrations through the very walls. Mac closed his eyes just for a moment, letting it sink in. The ovation went on for what felt like forever. When he finally stood from his stool, he expected his knees to shake, his hands to tremble, but they didn't. For the first time in years, he felt steady, whole. And as he took a small bow, someone from the back of the room shouted, "Welcome home, Mac." And that was when it hit him. He had spent 2 decades thinking New Orleans had forgotten him, but the truth was, it never had. After the show, the club emptied out slowly, people lingering in groups, still processing what they had just witnessed. Mac packed up his saxophone, his movements slow, thoughtful. He could feel it, the shift. The world wasn't the same as it had been before he stepped onto that stage. And then, from the corner of his eye, he saw him. Ray Carter, still standing near the back of the club, hands shoved into his pockets, shoulders hunched slightly. Mac sighed, debating whether he should just walk past him. But then Ray did something that stopped him. He took the old, tattered envelope from his jacket, the one containing the music he had stolen, and placed it on the nearest table. Then he turned to leave. Mac stared. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a request for forgiveness. It was something simpler, a quiet acknowledgement that Mac had won. And somehow that was enough. Mac took the envelope, tucked it into his case, and let Ray walk away. There were no more words to say. The night air was cool as Mac stepped onto Frenchman Street, the hum of the city alive with energy. Beside him, Olivia Morgan let out a breath, tucking her hands into her coat pockets. "Well," she said, glancing at him, "that was a hell of a way to come back." Mac let out a low chuckle. "Yeah, guess it was," she smirked. "So what now?" Mac looked out at the city. The same city he had once called home, the city he had once felt erased from, and now it belonged to him again. He tapped a hand against the saxophone case at his side and smiled. "Now," he said, "we keep playing." Olivia grinned. "Damn right we do." And as they walked off into the night, the music of New Orleans followed them, because this time Mac was listening, and so was the world. 1 month later, New Orleans Jazz Festival, the stage was larger this time. A full crew bustled around, adjusting microphones, tuning instruments, testing lights. Beyond the stage, thousands of people packed into the outdoor festival grounds. The air was alive with anticipation, buzzing with the kind of energy that only came from an audience that knew they were about to witness something special. Banners hung high above the crowd, showcasing the headlining performers, renowned jazz musicians, modern blues artists, and names that carried weight in the music industry. And right in the center of it all, in bold white letters, was a name the world had nearly forgotten. Marcus "Mac" Thompson. Mac stood backstage, gazing at the banner as the final moments ticked down before he would step out into the spotlight once again. It still didn't feel real. Just weeks ago, he had been playing for spare change on a street corner, his name little more than a whisper in the cracks of history. Now his face was plastered across festival posters. His name was on people's lips again. The world was listening, and this time he wasn't going to let it slip away. A man in a sleek navy blue suit approached him, a confident smile plastered across his face. Robert Lennox, a well-known music executive, extended his hand. "Mac, my man," Robert said smoothly. "I've been hearing a lot about you lately." Mac shook his hand but said nothing, waiting to see where this was going. Robert chuckled, pulling out his phone. "I won't waste your time. The video of your performance at Blue Note, it's sitting at 15 million views now, and let me tell you, the industry is paying attention." Mac exhaled, shaking his head in disbelief. 15 million. Yep, and climbing. Robert glanced at Olivia, who stood nearby, arms crossed, already skeptical of what was coming. Robert lowered his voice. "Listen, Mac, I've got 3 labels interested in signing you, and we're not talking small-time deals here. We're talking national tours, major recording contracts, hell, even a documentary about your comeback." Mac looked at Olivia, whose eyes narrowed slightly. She wasn't against record deals, but she had spent her career protecting artists from vultures like this. Mac studied Robert, then finally asked, "And what's the catch?" Robert smiled. No catch, just a partnership. We take care of the business, you take care of the music, Mac chuckled. That's what they told me last time, too. Robert hesitated, then nodded slowly. I get it. You've been burned before. But this time you've got power, Mac. You're the one they want, you call the shots. Mac turned to Olivia. She shrugged. Your call, he thought about it. Everything he had lost, everything he had fought to get back. Then slowly he shook his head. Nah, Mac said, I don't need a label. Robert's smile faltered. Excuse me. Mac tapped his saxophone case. For years they ignored me. They let me rot on the streets. Now they want a piece of my name, my music. He exhaled. I'm not letting anyone take that from me again. Robert opened his mouth to argue, but Mac was already walking away. He had a show to play. The announcer's voice boomed through the speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back to the stage Marcus Mac Thompson. The crowd exploded into applause. Mac stepped onto the stage, blinking against the bright lights, and what he saw nearly brought him to his knees. Thousands of people, some holding signs, others holding vinyl records of albums he had played on decades ago. People who had been waiting for him, people who never stopped listening. Mac swallowed hard, gripping the saxophone in his hands. He turned to his band, a mix of old friends and young musicians who had grown up hearing his story. Then he nodded, and they played. The music rolled through the festival grounds, flooding every corner, every space, filling every heart in the audience. It was raw. It was powerful, and more than anything, it was his. Every note was a declaration: I am here, I am alive, and I will never be forgotten again. As the set continued, Mac did something he never thought he would do. He stepped back, he motioned for one of the young saxophonists to take the lead. The kid, barely 20, froze, eyes wide. Mac grinned. Go on, kid, show him what you got. The young musician hesitated, then lifted his saxophone and played, and damn, he was good. Mac watched, a proud smile creeping across his face. This was how jazz survived. Not through record labels or businessmen in suits, but through mentorship, through passing the torch to the next generation. By the time the last note rang out, the crowd was on their feet, screaming, clapping, cheering his name. Mac took it all in, not as a street musician, not as a forgotten artist, but as a legend reborn. After the show, Mac sat on the festival stage, legs stretched out, watching the city skyline. Olivia sat beside him, sipping a beer, a smirk playing at her lips. So, she said, what now? Mac took a deep breath, looking out at the city he had once thought had abandoned him. He shook his head, smiling. Now, he tapped his saxophone case. We teach, we play, we keep the music alive. She raised an eyebrow. You mean like a school? Mac chuckled. Something like that. Because for the first time in 20 years, Mac wasn't thinking about the past. He was thinking about the future. A future where jazz was still alive. A future where no musician was left behind. A future where his legacy would live on, not just in records, but in the hands of every young musician who picked up a saxophone and played their heart out. Mac stretched his legs, watching the stars blink above the Mississippi River. And for the first time in a long, long time, he was exactly where he was meant to be.